Good afternoon. My name is Cornell William Brooks, and it's my pleasure to serve as moderator for this last panel discussion on the census. I come to this discussion having spent time at the head of the NAACP. And in the course of my travels, one of the things I took note of again and again was the fact that profound questions of democracy are debated and being debated across the length and breadth of this country with a vigor, with an energy, with a deep and profound sense of concern. And so when we think about the census and we think about the questions that are at the heart of an accurate count of the citizenry, it goes to the heart of the anxieties in the Republic. Namely, where people are being concerned, or I should say people are concerned about whether or not their votes are being counted, they're also concerned about whether or not they are in fact counted and that their power and their efficacy as citizens is in fact counted and that it counts for something. The discussion today is critically important. During the time that I spent at the NAACP, I reached out to a sister law school to the south in Connecticut, Yale Law School. And Yale is representing the NAACP in a suit concerning the Census Department, I should say concerning the census and the Department of Commerce, having everything to do whether or not this census will represent the integrity that the people are counting on. And so where we know historically young people have been undercounted, African Americans and Latinos have been undercounted, people in rural communities have been undercounted, certainly to the tune of at least 1.5 million people as of the last census. This is an incredibly important conversation, and so I'm delighted that we have two people here to help us think through these issues, and at the end of their presentations, of which each of them will give 10 minutes. We'll open the session up to questions and comments from the audience. The first person that we'll call on is John Thompson, who is the Executive Director of the Council of Professional Associations of Federal Statistics. He served previously as the 24th Director of the U.S. Census, previously spent time at the University of Chicago, but really spent the bulk of his career at the Census Bureau. He is someone who comes well-equipped and well-trained, holding both a bachelor's and a master's degree in mathematics from Virginia Tech. Thereafter, we will hear from Arturo Vargas, who is the Executive Director of NAACP, the Educational Fund. Previously, he served in terms of leadership positions at MOLDEF, as well as La Raza. He has a master's degree in education and a bachelor's degree in Spanish from Stanford. This is an incredibly important conversation and at a critical time in our democracy. With that said, I'll call on John.
Thank you, Cornell. So I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of frame what's going on in the census, how the census is being taken, and its current status, and then let Arturo bore into some of the serious risks that confront the census. Okay. Is this good? Okay. So let me start by saying how important the census is. You've been talking about redistricting. You need a good census for redistricting, but the census goes beyond redistricting. So, for example, over $600 billion a year in federal funds alone are allocated based on the census in some way or another. Every data collection activity, virtually every data collection activity that's done in the United States that uses any kind of population or housing in some way uses the census or the census carried forward. There's something called pop estimates where you carry forward the previous census using births and deaths. To be representative. So if the census is not representative of the population, then that gets carried forward for 10 years. So we're talking about something very important. So what is different about this census for 2020. So the way the census, the modern day census, has been taken started in 1970, where the process was you prepare an address list, you mail out to everyone on the address list, they mail back, you capture the information off the mailback forms, and then you go out and collect information from those that don't self-respond. That is the most difficult part of a census. It's the most expensive, and it's been paper and pencil in every census. And when you hire up to 1 million people and more and try to manage them with a paper and pencil operation, as the population, as the country gets more complex, more diverse, the only way you can deal with that is to throw more bodies at it, which is, if you look at graphs of the cost of the census, you'll see that its cost has been going up a lot more than inflation and population growth. So this census, the plan is to do something different. And most of the plan, I think, will get carried out. But it's based on using technology to make the census more efficient and to make it more accessible to the population. So, for example, the Census Bureau is changing the way people can respond. You used to have to mail in a questionnaire. Now you can respond by the internet. You're mailed a postcard. You're offered the opportunity to get online and respond. You can also get a mail questionnaire, or for the census, you can actually call in and give your information over the phone. All this is new. They're also introducing efficiencies and accuracies into preparing the address list by using modern geospatial technology. They're using government administrative records in new ways, the census, to reduce the workload of going out and collecting information from those that don't self-respond. This is also, that particular use of administrative records is new. It will be very modest for this census. The big thing that the Census Bureau is doing is using automation and handheld devices to collect the information from those that don't self-respond. So when you use mobile technology to do this, you can introduce a lot of efficiencies. So where is, and in fact, in 2015, the Census Bureau estimated that by using all this technology, using all these innovations, if they receive the proper funding, and I say if, then the cost of doing the 2020 census was going to be about $12.3 billion, as opposed to repeating the 2010 process in 2020, which would have been over $17 billion. So there were $5 billion in savings. Most of that has evaporated now. So where is the Census Bureau? The Census Bureau has, since 2012, has been underfunded by over $200 million in their appropriation. That is, what they requested from the Congress and what they got back is, over that period, is $200 million short, and that's 2012 through 2017. And that's forced the Census Bureau to prioritize on the automation. The Census Bureau is very concerned that they can't do a paper and pencil data collection effort in this country again for the collecting information from those that don't non-respond. So they need to automate. But that's forced some delays, that's forced some prioritization, and what's happened now is it's forced some of the operations in the census to go back to paper and pencil. These aren't big operations, but they're going back to paper and pencil. The biggest concern for the Census Bureau is they have had to defer work on their advertising and partnership program. So in 2000, the Census Bureau started paying for advertising and hiring partnership specialists. And the idea was to get advertising into local communities, in the kind of media local communities used, and to get local people to get two messages out to the communities. One message is why it's important to respond, and that varies from community to community. The other message was the census is very confidential. The census actually, so you all know, doesn't share data with anyone. The Census Act supersedes the Patriot Act, so it is. But to get the right kind of message out, you need someone local and trusted, particularly in these days, to say that. So that's critical to happen. And the concern right now, a big concern that a lot of us have, is that program has been delayed. And it's causing a lot of concerns. So with that backdrop, I'll turn it over to Arturo.
Good afternoon, and thank you for inviting me to be with you this afternoon. I have to be honest, it's quite exciting for me to say I am speaking at Harvard Law School because my husband is a Harvard undergrad graduate, I think class of 2001, and is currently a United States District Court judge in Los Angeles. So it's very exciting to say, hey, I'm speaking at a law school and you're sitting in a courtroom someplace dealing with mundane issues, and I get to talk about what I hope will be, at least what my goal is, to make you obsessive about the census and getting it right in 2020. We have spent the whole afternoon, the whole day, talking about redistricting. None of that will make any difference. Not the law, not the commissions, not the partisan gerrymandering, if the numbers are wrong. And the fact is that the numbers have always been wrong. People have never been accurately counted in any single census, and most especially the people that we care most about in terms of being vulnerable communities. People of color, immigrants, poor people, children, they have never been accurately counted. So every single district that has been drawn in this country has been malapportioned, because it has excluded, because of the data set, those very same people. And it is the census that is the only thing that the federal government does. It's the only thing that the federal government does in which every single person in this country is actually equal. That's it. It's only the census. You can't vote if you're not 18 and a citizen. Not everybody has to file income taxes. Not everybody's treated equally except in the census. You could be a billionaire or a homeless transgender youth living, in a shelter, and you both only count as one, if you get counted. Now, I have been working on the census now since the 1990 census, and it happens every 10 years, so do the math. I've been in this for a long time. And I have been actually watching the Census Bureau prepare for Census 2020 since the early part of the last decade, because it always starts about 15, 20 years in advance preparing for a particular decennial census. And every single census has been framed by a particular theme. The 1990 census, the big issue was Congress actually was working very hard to pass legislation to exclude undocumented immigrants from the apportionment count. In the 2000 census, Congress fought tooth and nail on the issue of census sampling. In the 2010 census, we had some misguided faith leaders trying to convince immigrants to boycott the census as a way of punishing policymakers. I thought this census was going to finally be about one of the biggest errors in the decennial census, and that is the fact that very young children do not get counted, as other populations do. Bill O'Hare, who's the foremost demographer on data on children, did an analysis of the 2010 census data, comparing it in a method called demographic analysis, looking at births, death certificates, actual population changes, migration changes, and found that the 2010 census was missing 100 million babies and very young children.
No, not 100 million.
1 million. 1 million. 1 million. Thank you. I'm sorry, I'm getting so excited about this. This actually means something to me, and it should mean to all of us. 1 million children excluded. 400,000 of them by way Latino, very young children. And they're concentrated in urban areas. And so we thought this was going to be the census about finally getting that right. Okay, that now has become a secondary, maybe tertiary issue in terms of the real challenges we're dealing with in the 2020 census. First of all, Director Thompson described some of the major changes that are happening in 2020. I don't know if any of you remember the 1960 census. Does anybody remember 1960? Okay, a few hands. okay? 1970? And every census since then, forget what you thought about those censuses. This census will be fundamentally different by the processes that John just described. The number one driver for doing the census differently, by the way, is congressional mandate on the Census Bureau to save money. The Congress told the Census Bureau, you will conduct a 2020 census by spending not a penny more than you spent in 2010 and 2010 dollars. So that's what the Census Bureau came up with, the $5 billion savings that it has to come up with. And that's what's been driving a lot of these innovations, for better or for worse. And it makes sense that the Bureau wants to conduct an online census. How many of you do business online? Right? We all do. Amazon, we buy our plane tickets, we talk to each other online. The computers are part of our lives. It makes sense, but it's not the part of the lives of those people who are most likely to be persistently left out of the census. So it makes sense to introduce technology. It also introduces more risk. Administrative records. The Bureau says we can save money by not sending somebody to a house that doesn't return the census form or respond online, by looking at other sources of information. And the public says, why is the Bureau asking me all these nosy questions when they know well exactly who lives here? Because they have it, the IRS knows, Social Security knows, Medicaid knows. So Census Bureau, go over there, bother them, don't bother me. That's what the public says. So it makes sense. And the Bureau, in fact, now is still looking at what other sources of data can it go to either complete the address file or to look at how, when it does the non-response follow-up, that most expensive part of the census, to quite literally fill in the blanks for forms that are not returned or returned incomplete. Makes sense, but introduces more risk. Because by definition, there are some people who are most likely to be excluded from the census who shouldn't be on some of these databases. If you're an undocumented immigrant, you have no business having a Social Security number. Yet those are the people who are most likely to be undercounted in the census. And again, young children. And some of these data sources may not have race and ethnicity data. And if you're redistricting, you need to know exactly the race and ethnicity if you're going to comply with the Voting Rights Act and draw fair districts. Another thing that the census is going to be doing in 2020 is to shrink the workforce. Again, for cost savings, but it also makes sense. If you're going to use all this technology, you don't need that to hire those many bodies. But we know that the bodies it does hire, that the Bureau needs to make sure that those bodies are culturally competent, that the people it sends out to knock on those doors finally to try to get the information need to be trusted individuals in those communities. But if you have a smaller workforce and currently a very low unemployment rate, it's going to be tough for the Bureau to hire the right workforce in order to conduct this count in 2020. Perhaps the biggest operational challenge that the Bureau has today is that it simply has been starved in preparing for the 2020 census. John mentioned the $200 million. So the Bureau has been doing all these innovations. Let's have people respond online. Let's use all these administrative records. Let's use mobile devices. Let's have people fill it out on their smartphones. The Bureau needs to test this stuff to make sure it works. But the problem is that because the Bureau has been starved, it had to cancel some of the tests. And it hasn't been able to actually implement the plan as it had originally envisioned. So by concentrating on the technology, the Bureau has been taking shortcuts in other elements of the count. Some of those shortcuts we care very much about because they're designed to actually motivate people who are most likely not to want to fill out their census forms to participate. An advertising campaign, the partnership program. These are hiring people to mobilize the trusted messengers, the priests and the pastors and the teachers and the first responders and the other people that hopefully the public will listen to and trust them when they're told fill out their census forms, as opposed to John's successor, the next director of the Census Bureau, who will be charged with doing that. So that's not happening. The Secretary of Commerce a couple of weeks ago actually went into a hearing and did something that was extraordinary for this administration. It actually requested more money for a federal activity that was not military. The Secretary of Commerce requested an additional $187 million for this next fiscal year, recognizing how much the Bureau had been starved up until now. But even that is not a sufficient amount, in the opinion of many advocates, of how much money the Bureau needs now. And we're already at the end of 2017. April 1st, 2020 is Census Day. April 1st, 2018 represents some key deadlines that the Census Bureau needs to meet, and there's only so much time left between now and then. And even more money at this point may not make the difference. April 1st, 2018, by the way, is what the Census Bureau calls the end-to-end test. And we used to call it the dress rehearsal, the dry run. The let's do the census in real time and these real environments to figure out if it's going to work as we planned. Well, because the Bureau doesn't have the funding, it has canceled 2 of the 3 test sites. And will only do the test, the end-to-end test, only in Providence County, Rhode Island. So just consider that for a second. Lastly, what really is the theme of the census is to convince the public to participate and to actually trust the federal government that nothing will happen to you by participating in the census. Now think about what we have to do. We're going to have to convince the American public that come March 2020, you're going to get a letter from the Census Bureau saying the census is coming, be prepared. And then you're going to get another letter that says, okay, it's time to be counted. Go to www.census.gov or something.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah, see, I know what I'm talking about. And go to a laptop, a standalone, a tablet, a smartphone, and type in the name of every person who lives in your house. Tell us their age, tell us their gender, tell us the relationship they have to the head of the household, tell us their race or ethnicity, and then press submit, send it into the federal government, and trust us. Nothing's going to happen. So, first of all, there's a whole bunch of people out there who think the Russians are going to get the information. And there's a whole bunch of people who think, you're kidding me. This administration is going to keep this information confidential and nothing's going to happen to me?
Right.
An earlier speaker this morning talked about a conversation we had last week at the National Advisory Committee of the Census Bureau, of which I have the privilege to be a member. And I was asked to be a discussant on some research that the Census Bureau did without having planned in advance, because in the field, census staff were doing some other non-related work to the decennial census, or even some work in preparation for the census, have been observing something they haven't seen before. Spontaneous fear of actually providing information to census workers. And these are people who have been pre-screened in some way to participate in the pre-testing. Because the Census Bureau has reached out to a community organization and said, hey, we need to test this form. Can you help us find some people in your community who would be willing to participate? And by the way, we'll pay them some money, an incentive to participate. And the interviewers have been talking to these people, pre-screened, and having given a financial incentive, and the people are like, oh no, I can't tell you who lives here. And in one case, a census worker actually reported that he was sitting in an apartment interviewing somebody, and that person walked out of his own apartment, leaving the census worker by himself, because he started to ask about who else lives here. So that's the kind of fear that we're dealing with. We have an environment in which the public fears its own government. And this fear is not irrational. This fear is not unfounded, and it's very real, and it's probably the biggest challenge the Bureau will have in trying to get a fair and accurate count in the 2020 census. So we have a heavy lift to do. We have just over 2 years actually, till Census Day 2020. And so all the conversations we've been having about fair and accurate districts and gerrymandering, if we don't get that count right in 2020, and if the undercount of immigrants, of poor people, of people of color, of children, is worse in 2020 than in 2000 and 2010 or 1990, all the districts we end up drawing at the end of the day will be fundamentally malapportioned, and we will be underrepresenting the very same people that need greater voice in our democracy. Thank you.
Thank you. So to start off the conversation, let me just pick up on the last point that was made with respect to the anxiety in the public. So to the extent that you have a digital divide, anxieties about cybersecurity, and then online strategies being used or deployed for the first time, how does that impact who you partner with and how you market the effort?
How you market the effort? First of all, you need money to market the effort. The Census Bureau had a plan of how much it wanted to spend on that marketing effort. My understanding is that the Bureau now has told the vendor that it has hired to do the communications plan to come up with a plan B that spends less on trying to educate the American public and those communities most likely not to be counted, to reach out to them. To the point that dress rehearsal, I mentioned, that end-to-end test, will not have a single communication strategy. And I still don't understand this. The Bureau is going to do a dress rehearsal, an end-to-end test, with no PSAs, with no money spent on television, on radio, to let the public know that it actually is doing this census test, and that it's going to rely on volunteers. Now, I don't know how this is going to take that dress rehearsal and then try to apply it in a national 2020 environment, not knowing exactly what are the messages that are going to work to motivate people to participate.
John? Well, just a little bit in defense of the Bureau. They are doing probably one of the most one important component of doing that. They're doing a survey to measure attitudes across the country to start the basis for developing the methods. So they are doing that. The other thing that I found interesting, but it has to happen because we haven't seen the details, was Wilbur Ross at this testimony, both of his testimonies mentioned that in the new plan for the census, he has over $500 million for advertising, which is more dollars than they spent previously. But the problem with that is we haven't seen any of the details to see when is it going to be spent, is it in there, but.
Yep.
And with whom?
And with whom?
And with whom.
Yeah.
So,
But John did mention something very important, the CBAMs, Census, Barriers, Attitudes, and Motivators. And the Bureau's doing this national poll to try to actually determine what is the current public's temperature around the census. And it's done it before. It's not just only being done for this decennial. This time, the CBAM is going to be absolutely critical. Now, the question is, will the Bureau have the time and the resources to actually take those data that it learns from the polls, to do the focus groups, to then come up with the messengers? One of my messages to, frankly, to the Bureau is that it needs a secondary strategy. It doesn't just need a strategy to educate the public about participating. It needs a strategy to convince what they call the trusted messengers to participate in the role of convincing their stakeholders and their constituents to participate in the census. You know, that the priest, the teacher, the first responder, the pastor, those that the Bureau says, they'll believe you, they won't believe me because I'm a federal employee. Well, I'll tell you, I represent the National Association of Latino elected and appointed officials. Some of my members have already told me that they have no intention of encouraging their constituents to fill out the census forms because they themselves aren't convinced that this data would be safe and confidential. That's who the Bureau needs to reach first. And they don't have a strategy for that yet.
On that note, let's go to the audience. There are I believe two traveling microphones. So my colleague in the second to last row on the left.
I'll pass the mic to you. Hi, I actually have two questions. I'm Erica Wood from the Ford Foundation. Nice to see you all. The first question is, based on everything that you've just said, is there a role for some of our Silicon Valley tech companies, Google, Facebook, others? And if so, how do you envision that? What are the risks of that, but what are the opportunities of that? And second, actually not that related, is there any insight into who will be named as the new director of the Census Bureau? Any update on that?
So at this point, the Census Bureau needs, I would think, they've got the tech lined up, and I think they'll do that. What they need help on, though, is like Arturo said, is really getting the word out and marshaling the messages about why it's important. And so working with them, and there's some foundations also working right now on mobilizing the census, I think would be important. And no, there's no director name that's been public. But that is going to be a very important message that the administration is going to send when they ultimately name the new director. So it's going to be really critical that they put someone in that can get the confidence of people like Arturo and the groups he represents. But I think that's going to be a really telling appointment.
Okay. I think there was, I thought there was a gentleman right here, and then here, third row in the front.
Hi, Stephen Caraboa here from New York. I find it hard to believe that, considering the political situation that we're living through, considering people's skepticism and the prevalence of this view of fake news, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, it seems hard for me to envision a decennial census that will not be a disaster. I wish it was otherwise, but it's hard to be dissuaded of that. So the question is, if that comes to pass, is there any precedent for a census that didn't work to the extent to which the next one might not work? And is there a conceivable contingency plan, a plan B, towards that scenario?
So in 1920, the census was not used for reapportionment or redistricting. And the Congress actually decides whether to accept the census. And in 1920, they did not accept the census. At that point, the United States was moving from predominantly rural to predominantly urban. And I don't believe the House of Representatives, I wasn't there, but I don't believe the House of Representatives wanted to make that change. So the plan B was they used the previous census for the next 10 years.
Lady in the third row. Just answer your question. And there was gentleman 3 rows from the back on the right, and then here.
Can I amend that answer a little bit? So in the United States, there are ways to seek remedies. So you can seek remedies. There have been lawsuits about the accuracy of the census. So it conceivably could be that there could be remedies sought if the 2020 census had serious deficiencies.
I want to ask the question a little bit more as an advocate. So I really feel better educated about the problem and the risk and the consequence, right? But I don't know that I'm hearing the path from today to 2020 in today's political reality, what should we be doing? What should we be asking for? What is the, there's the public message that is, here's the consequence, and that part I get, but that's not an ask. It's not an ask of the people. It's not an ask of politicians. And if you could fill in that gap a little bit, please, so that we know what our message is in order to achieve the best potential result. Not just, here is the disaster, because, I think there's a lot of people who want a disaster. They want people to be undercounted. They want the system to fail. So what are we actually advocating for? That's my question to you.
That actually was going to be the wrap-up question for the moderator to us both. So I'll start. One is, as advocates, we cannot let the census fail. If we actually believe in fair representation and democracy, then we have to save the census. We have to start first with making sure that the Bureau has the resources it needs to carry out the job that it is constitutionally mandated to do. So we have been working, a whole group of advocates, some of them have been at this table earlier today, working with the support of foundations. You heard from Erica Wood from the Ford Foundation, Erica Teasley from Open Society Foundations have been meeting, coordinating foundations earlier than ever in a decennial to try to actually come up with a third-party strategy of the nonprofit sector, the advocacy sector, to try to figure out how do we save the census. First thing we need to do is to make sure that we pressure the administration and the Congress to appropriate sufficient funding for the 2020 decennial census. And the fact that the Secretary of Commerce actually made this request, I think, is some indication of success that we've had so far, but we can't let up, because that's FY 2018. We still have FY 2019 and FY 2020. So number one, we have to support the census, get funding for it. Number two, we have to be very vigilant about who ultimately gets appointed to the political positions that will be in leadership at the Census Bureau. The people who are the career folks at the Census Bureau are true professionals, and they are devoted to their missions. But they're not their best own advocates, and they're not very politically savvy. And so we actually need to be the watchdogs about the appointees that will come to run the Bureau between now and the decennial. And if somebody ends up being appointed without the qualifications to run the largest civilian mobilization that this country carries out every 10 years, and to do so in a nonpartisan way, then we're going to need to speak out very forcefully and very clearly. And number three, we need ourselves to prepare that intervention to promote the participation of the public. Because while the Bureau will do what it can with the resources it has, it will not be enough. And we're going to need to actually develop, in my opinion, a movement that convinces people to be counted in the census. That, in fact, that the people who would want to do you harm or who would like to see you not have a voice in our democracy are the people who want to make sure you don't fill out your census form. So actually being counted needs to become a way of self-defense. Now, we need to test that message to see if that actually will work. But that's what I think the three strategies should be. Give the Bureau the resources it needs, make sure it has the leadership, qualified and nonpartisan, to lead the Bureau during this time, and then we need to do our own efforts to promote public participation.
I agree.
John agrees.
No, of course.
Okay. This gentleman, 4 rows back in the gray sweater, and then here in the first row.
Just real quick, I'm wondering whether the funding decreases, if anybody wants to comment on this, or maybe people don't, are sort of a hedge against the outcome of the gerrymandering decision that might come out from the Supreme Court, in that, you know, if you can reduce the count, then you can preserve the balance of power as it presently is, as opposed to if everybody gets counted.
So let me mention that a lot of these funding cuts came through with the Obama administration in charge, and with Secretary Penny Pritzker in charge of the Census Bureau. And there wasn't any, there was a real motivation to get the most accurate count we could from the administration. And so I don't think there was the push to not try hard to get everyone. I didn't get the opportunity to work, excuse me, with the new administration, so I can't comment that much on them. I didn't get any pressure for the time I was there, but I certainly wasn't part of the administration team.
Right here. In the first row, sir, in the black sweater with the visor. Yes.
I'm interested in the undercut and the underfunding, the undercount, which a lot has been made of. I'm 80 years old. I'm wondering what's the history? Has this problem, decade by decade, been getting seriously worse? And I assume you don't expect much improvement in 2020. So that's for the undercount. And I'm wondering, what is the thinking in Congress? Do they repeat it? Has the underfunding problem also been a continuing issue over the years? And what is behind the thinking, since surely there must be some awareness in Congress of the importance of an accurate count. Thank you.
I'll take some of those, and I know John will have some reactions as well. The thing to keep in mind when we talk about undercounts and counts and the accuracy of the census is what's called the differential undercount. Because of the count of the total population over time has actually been getting better, right? The Bureau says that in 2010 it was like, what, less than 1% off? 0.2% off. But that's because it looks at who it counted more than once compared to who it didn't count at all. It balanced out. But when think about what you do with redistricting, it's these people who get excluded who you want to make sure are fairly represented. So the differential undercount is what we need to look at. To what extent were African Americans, Latinos, poor people, immigrants, children excluded from the census, and then who gets counted more than once? White women actually are the most overcounted population. And there are other populations as well. People with two houses, right? They get two census forms, they fill them out twice. College students, they get counted at home, they get counted at the dorm. There's lots of people who get overcounted. So that's the thing to keep in mind. The other thing about the Census Bureau, and this is where, you know, it often is not its own best advocate, because over the course of the decade, it often becomes the source of money that Congress raids for their pet projects, where a member of Congress will say, oh, I need to save this program in my district, so I need to find $10 million. Oh, I'll take it from the Census Bureau's budget, because that census is 6 years away. And that happens all decade long. And it just undermines the census preparations for the decennial. And Congress only starts paying attention to the decennial in about 1 or 2 years out, and that's the period in which we find ourselves. Congress finally right now is starting to pay attention to the 2020 census.
Arturo had a great summary. I would say that the differential undercount has been consistently getting smaller, but it is still a differential undercount, and it's still a problem that needs to be solved.
It's been consistently getting smaller.
Right.
But to follow up on this question, is the set of circumstances we face now such that the prospect of differential undercount being a greater threat to democracy in terms of vulnerable communities? And is there a greater question of accountability for Congress? I.e., you get it wrong, we're going to call you into account and call you not to count on this census.
Well, Congress is accountable because it's Congress who appropriates the resources and the money. But this census will be on this administration. This will be Wilbur Ross's census. This will be Karen Kelly Dunn?
Karen Dunn Kelly.
Karen Dunn Kelly, who's the Undersecretary for Economic Affairs, who has direct responsibility over the Census Bureau. This will be on them. So this is really this administration's legacy, one of their legacies, that we need to hold them accountable to.
Over here, sir.
Hi, thank you for a scary way to end this interesting day. I've done IT all my life, and when I hear about a large-scale technology rollout being done under heavily truncated time and resource constraints, the first thing I think about are the cybersecurity shortcuts that are almost certainly being taken because they're not visible. We live in an environment now where hostile actor or actors have turned against many of our basic processes of democracy. And, as you've made clear, this is a basic process of democracy. So I have a two-part question. One, are the cybersecurity efforts being taken at a level where it's assumed that there'll be people with the resources of a nation state, attacking the census in any way they can, simply to undermine the confidence in it or divide the nation about it? And second, this is obviously one of a few ways this could turn into a disaster. Where, on a triage list, where would you put that one?
John,
Yeah, so one of the things that the Census Bureau has been fairly slow on developing their IT systems, and they've been spending more money on them than they planned. And a significant reason for that has been the devotion to cybersecurity. So they are building in cybersecurity, and they do work with the Department of Homeland Security, and they work with the National Institute of Science and Technology and some private sector companies to build systems and then do independent penetration testing. So they're constantly working on that, but it's just, you have to be constantly vigilant. And the other thing that they're really worried about, which is a little bit of a different kind of cyber, is attacks on the credibility of the census, which don't really mean that you have to penetrate the census. You just have to start spreading fake news. For example, that the census is turning over their data to Homeland Security. And if you start promulgating fake news like that, then the people Arturo wants to count aren't going to want to be counted. So that's another thing that's really troubling.
And we had another experience as a country recently in trying to do a mass mobilization through the internet called health.gov. Okay, now we're going to have census.gov. And not everybody had to fill out their application for health insurance. But the Census Bureau is hoping that at least half of all the nation's households will go to www.census.gov and fill out their census forms, and hopefully nothing's going to crash.
Chilling. Ma'am.
Just for clarification, where does the census stand on undocumented people? Do you collect their names and where they live and their status? No, that's question number one. And number two is, you keep saying, oh, we have to convince people to trust us, but can you say something a little bit more about the mechanics of why people should trust you? Thank you.
So, sure. So the first question, and Arturo, I'm sure will comment on this as well, is the census counts everyone in the United States. In fact, there have been some opinions offered, not tested in court, that in order not to count everyone in the United States, you would have to change the Constitution. On the other hand, the census does not ask anything about legal status. That's not on the census. They don't ask citizenship on the census. They do ask it on a couple other surveys. There have been bills already introduced that have not gone anywhere to put citizenship and legal status on the census, which would be unfortunate if that ever happened.
So part of my pillow talk at home is about the 14th Amendment. Remember, I'm married to a federal judge. There shall be an enumeration of all persons.
That's right.
Not all white people, as it was when the Constitution was first written. What does it say all white people? It say all 3/5 of other people and refer to slaves. It doesn't say all men. Remember, women couldn't vote when this country was founded. When I said that this is the one thing the government does where all of us is equal, this is it. Every person who lives in this country on April 1st, 2020, has to be counted according to the Constitution. Now, the second question was on...
What are we doing?
Oh, what are we doing? No, the confidentiality. Title 13 of the U.S. Code requires confidentiality in the census. And there are very strict penalties that every Census Bureau employee is subject to if he or she were to divulge any person's personal information. And that is one of the strictest levels of protections that exists in federal law when it comes to confidentiality. Now, to try to explain that to the public is in itself a challenge. But Title 13 is, in fact, what governs the safety of the data in the census.
Ma'am, does that go to your question in terms of the mechanics?
The thing that people will say is, oh, there are strict penalties on individual people who violate it. Is there anything, I mean, okay, if that's it, if that's what you would say.
Well,
I think I hear your question to be, like, how do you build trust? Like, what are the mechanics of it?
It's not about the individual census taker. The individual census taker, yes, that's good to know. That's a good answer. But what about the idea that people in the government can just get that if they want it? It's in their computer system. Or I'm really trying to be like a person that doesn't trust. And I'm thinking, well, what would I say to somebody?
Right.
I wouldn't get very far.
so that really gets to the heart of what Arturo was talking about earlier. And it's the communication strategy that has to, as Arturo said, it has to also be directed at the individuals, the organizations that the Census Bureau needs to get the message out. So there's got to be a real interchange about why the census is confidential with these organizations, leaders, so that they can then mobilize and feel confident in getting the message out. And the census, if they get the right funding, will sit down and work with these organizations and get the message to them and answer their questions as to what they have. But they have to get the money, and they have to put that campaign together.
So I'll take this question, and then we have to wrap up thereafter.
Just to build on that question, so what is to stop DHS from reverse engineering this information to identify households with undocumented populations, not individuals? What's to stop the DHS from collating all of the information that you have access to, such as IRS, Social Security, school board registration, to put that information? I mean, that's what we're worried about. We're talking about people that are afraid of their government. And let's just switch this conversation to guns for a second to make, for that to click in with everyone.
Right, so again, there is nothing currently on the decennial census form that asks, are you a citizen, yes or no? What is your status, yes or no? Some people in Congress would like to change that. But currently, the Census Bureau does not ask if you're a citizen or not. This asks what's your name, your age, your gender, your race and ethnicity, and your relationship to the head of household. That's the basic data collected in the census. which, if I can take this opportunity to mention another dramatic change that the Bureau is hoping to do in the 2020 census, is to completely redesign how it collects information of how we identify our race and ethnicity. Currently, there's a two-question structure where the Bureau has been asking everybody, are you Hispanic, yes or no? And then there's some boxes you can check off. Then the next question is, what is your race? That has been a very confusing construct. And for the past 10 years, the Bureau has been doing extensive research about how to better ask that question. And they have decided to recommend a combined question where basically the Census Bureau says, what are you? And then you can check off as many boxes as you want and to identify your race or ethnicity. Now we're waiting to get some direction from the Office of Management and Budget about revisions to the standards on race and ethnicity to see if in fact this combined question can go forward.
So, let me say something. That this will also be another message that we will receive from the current administration regarding the commitment to an accurate count, because the census research has demonstrated that you do get a more accurate count by using this new question. And the Census Bureau shared their information on which they based this conclusion, and a number of organizations, including both the organizations here, have endorsed that question as providing more accurate information. So that has gone forward, and so we're waiting to see what will come back from the administration if there is a commitment to getting a complete and accurate count.
Okay. So before we call up Miles Rappaport, who's really the engineer for this conversation, along with the Ad Center, I'd like to ask Arturo and John just to summarize what is to be done. I mean, GAO has declared the census program to be a high-risk program. We're this many years out. We have to deploy a number of strategies, new technologies. There's much anxiety with the public. What can we do between now and then, both in terms of the advocates and the third-party validators? Anybody else you'd like to address in a couple minutes each? And then we'll call up Miles.
Actually, I think Arturo's answer, which I agree with completely before, about the three things that have to happen, are just incredibly important to getting a complete and accurate census. I mean, the Census Bureau can't do it by themselves. They need to construct a huge family organization web of contacts to reach out to get everyone to be counted. And they can't do it as simply the federal government, because that's going to be very difficult over the next, well, at least through 2020, to get that kind of message out. So they're going to need a lot of help to build the kind of networks they need to get the right kind of motivation.
Mm-hmm. Arturo?
I'll just reiterate what I said earlier. We cannot let Census 2020 fail. There is too much at stake for our democracy, for fairness, for representation, for resources our communities will need over the next decade that will be allocated based on these numbers that will be collected over the course of those few months in 2020. So we need to support the Census Bureau, make sure it gets the resources that it needs to prepare in these 2 years left before 2020. We need to be vigilant to make sure that the leadership that is put in place has the commitment and the expertise and the qualifications to lead this decennial census, and we need to do our own intervention as well to make sure our communities, those most likely to be left out, are in fact counted.
Help me thank John and Arturo for a really, really powerful presentation. And call up Miles.
I'm up. Oh, thank you.
Okay. Yes, let me join in thanking the panel for a really exciting, if not exactly uplifting, end to a long and really good day. I just want to say a couple of thank yous. One, I really want to say a real shout out to the Ask Center staff who worked on this. Teresa Acuna is not here. but Melissa Danilo, who's in the sort of chief of staff of the whole operation, Dan Harsha, Sarah Grucha, and Julianne Cresimano have been just absolutely extraordinary. This is a lot of work, a lot of people, a lot of moving parts, and all of it came together fairly seamlessly, at least in front of the scene, for today. So can you all take a little bit of a bow, and wave and say thank you? I also want to thank all of you, and those of you who were here for other parts of it, for some real stamina and perseverance through a long, but I think really, really interesting day. What we had is sort of an incredible sort of guided tour of the issues around redistricting, gerrymandering, et cetera. We started out with a history from Alex Kesar, which was really quite remarkable. We had, I thought, a really serious discussion which really delved into the issue of how race will impact the redistricting process and will be impacted by the redistricting process, and the persistence of the issue and the centrality of it. I thought that was quite remarkable. The lunch session was pretty lively and pretty interesting. It was really good that we had both the Republican and Democratic views represented. And I thought that the panel that we had, that E.J. Dion did with the solutions, with people who were really leading practitioners of that, was really extraordinary. So I think it's really been a good day. I had 3 takeaways, but now I'm going to add a 4th that I just that really hit me. One is that this is clearly an issue whose time has arrived. I think people are, it's getting more publicity, more press, more intensity, more concern at all levels of our political community, and I think that's really good and important. Number 2, reform is possible. I left the earlier afternoon panel really kind of encouraged that between legislative reforms, ballot initiatives, court proceedings, maybe including Gill v. Whitford, but we don't know, and the general sense of serious citizen involvement, that it's really possible between now and 2021 that some reforms will be made and that we'll get a much better way of doing the redistricting come 2021 and 2022. And that leads to my third takeaway, which was the critical importance of citizen involvement. I think every single person, to me, stressed that this is not a static and impenetrable process. Even if we don't make process reforms, even if it's done by the same partisan structures that did it last time around, it can be done very differently. With the new technologies, with a real sense of involvement and intensity, with holding people accountable who are doing it, with demanding transparency in the process, whoever's doing it. I think all of this is just a requirement that citizens get involved, and I think hopefully today's conference is a way to help give people the tools and information that they need. So now I have to add the 4th one, which is we better damn well pay attention to the census because it is, as the panelists pointed out, the anchor, the bedrock from which the redistricting is done. And if it gets screwed up, then it's who knows where we're going to end up come 4 or 5 years from now. So let me say a word about tonight. So we're ending the program today. Everyone is welcome to go over to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Now, I have to tell you a little bit about this. Unless I assume all of you know much more about this than I did up until a month ago, but just on the off chance that some of you don't, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences was founded in 1780 to be the think tank and the arts generator for the new nation. It's headquartered in Cambridge, about a quarter of a mile from here, maybe half a mile at the most. And they have been, it is a society where they elect 20 or 30 fellows a year, starting with Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton, going up through Albert Einstein, Marion and Anderson, Jules Pfeiffer. It's a quite extraordinary genius. And at their house, they call it the House of the Academy, the letters of acceptance from all of these people over 2 centuries are framed and on the wall. So it's quite an extraordinary moment of history that you get to see. So Archon and I were at a meeting there a month or 2 ago on a different subject, and discovered that they were planning their stated meeting. Now, why do they call it a stated meeting? Because in their charter from 1780, they are required to have meetings on stated dates. And so over the years, the stated dates meeting got shortened to be stated meetings. And they were having their stated meeting tonight on the issue of redistricting and representation. So we thought, well, rather than say, gee, we have two events on the same issue on the same day, let's combine them. And to the Academy's great credit, they said, sure, come on over. So everyone who is here today is invited to go over. There's a shuttle bus. Where's Julianne? Where's the shuttle bus exactly?
Downstairs in front of Austin Hall in the main parking lot, just adjacent.
Okay. And if people want to walk, how do we do that?
Yeah, I can give people the address and we can talk downstairs.
Okay, it's a very easy walk, but it's a little chilly, and the shuttle bus will just go over and back there. What's happening over there? Walking directions are in the program, but of course, thanks to the Cracker Jack team. Anyway, so there's a reception that starts at 5, so I'm sort of killing time so we don't arrive too early. And then from 6 to 7:30, there is a program which includes Moon Duchin, Gary King, who's a Harvard professor, moderated by Patty Saris, the Chief Justice of the Massachusetts Supreme Court, and I think it's going to be a really interesting program. So you're all welcome to come over. It's free and open to the public, and I guarantee you will be as blown away by the headquarters of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences as I was. All right, so thank you very much for coming. I think we're adjourned.